Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the CSIS Africa program and the Global Food Security Project, I'd like to welcome you all to CSIS for today's event on In El Niño's Wake, examining Africa's latest food crisis. I'm Jennifer Cooke. I direct the Africa program, and I'm delighted to be collaborating with Kimberly Flowers, who directs the Food Security Project, and her team. I want to thank Benjamin Hubner and Megan Schneider for their help in preparing for this event. And Ben Hubner, who's in the back there, program coordinator for the Africa program, is also today's safety officer. So if there's an alarm or anything happens, Ben will step to the podium and we'll all follow his instructions. I'm instructed to say that. So we're here today to talk about the El Niño weather phenomenon and the impact it's having in sub-Saharan Africa, most acutely in Eastern and Southern Africa. This year, the 2015-2016 El Niño is among the worst on record. It's causing persistent drought in some regions, heavy rains and flooding in others. It's having a devastating effect on crop and livestock production, and it has precipitated a food security crisis that has left some 20 million people food insecure in Eastern Africa, and in Southern Africa may raise the number of food insecure to 40 million in the first half of this year. In Southern and Eastern Africa combined, some 10 million children are at suffering from severe acute malnutrition. And while today we're going to focus on the food security impact, I think it's important to remember, and it's worth remembering, that it has knock-on effects on education, on health, on livelihoods, on displacement, and amplifies the vulnerabilities of already vulnerable communities, rural and urban poor, communities living with HIV, AIDS, and so forth. What's remarkable to me is how little media attention this crisis has gotten in U.S. media, even as national government, donor governments, and international organizations are scrambling to respond. So it's big news in the food security community, perhaps less so beyond that, with so many things happening in the world today. So today we're delighted to have two panels of experts who are deeply engaged in improving food security outcomes, both in response to the immediate crisis, but also in building greater resilience in the face of future weather variability. Our first panel is going to look at some of the immediate impacts, how governments are responding, what is El Niño, and our second panel will take a slightly longer view. How has this response differed from those of the past? In other words, how have investments in resilience been paying off? What are the gaps, and what are some of the promising models that might mitigate against future crises? Just a program note, we had 2 last-minute cancellations this morning because of last-minute conflict and schedule conflict, and someone lost their voice. There's a bug going around at this time, but we'll go on without. We're going to start today's session. We'll turn to the first panel now with Jeremiah Lengoasa, who is Deputy Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. We've asked Jeremiah to launch our discussion and help us better understand what is El Niño, how does this El Niño event compare with those of the past, what's been the trajectory, and what that might mean in future. And we're then going to turn to Chris Hillbruner, who of FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, which is a leader in providing analysis and prediction on food security. And he will talk a little bit about what FuseNet does and then the broader food security impact that the El Niño event is having. And finally, we'll turn to Dina Esposito, who has a long title, Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, former Director of Food for Peace. And Dina will be talking about how the U.S. is responding to these immediate needs, but how it's doing so with an eye to some of the issues that we'll discuss in our second panel, which is the resilience building and the longer-term food security. So with that, I will turn to Jeremiah Jeremiah, thank you so much for being with us today. I know he traveled from Geneva to be with us, and we're most grateful for that. So, Jeremiah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I preferred to stand as I was sitting for about 9 hours yesterday. And I did decide to take a walk yesterday afternoon. It was fairly windy, but it was okay. Slightly chillier than Europe. I would like to talk a bit about the El Niño phenomenon, and I do apologize in advance for those that may not be technically inclined, that I will tend to be somewhat scientific to some extent, but also try and explain as much as is possible what the phenomenon is, and also a bit about its impacts, but also talk about some of the initiatives that now exist, which did not exist in the past, which we think will add most immense value to how to deal with these extreme natural variability in the future. This was El Niño, of course, over time. The emergence of this was the recognition on the coast of Peru over many centuries on the failure of the fish catch in certain times, especially around the Christmas period, and thus the name El Niño. The child, the boy child. At the same time, across the world, droughts and failure of monsoon rainfall, either in India, in Africa, or in China, were always observed. And so the impacts were always global. The current El Niño is no different. Zimbabwe, I flew there in August, and it was in October, it was as dry as it would normally be in a July. The impact was quite severe and very obvious, and it's always a privilege, of course, to fly over because you have a bird's eye view of territory that I'm often familiar with, having been born in South Africa. Chennai, India, floods. Peru, flash floods, quite severe, and of course, you would all recall Indonesia, and I'll talk a bit about that in a few moments. So, again, in the present context, the global impacts are quite evident. So what is El Niño? It's a natural part of the climate system, and it occurs when the ocean, the Pacific Ocean and the atmosphere above it change from so-called neutral conditions for several seasons, and it is associated with a warming of the central and the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. So in this diagram, hopefully you can see just the color changes. On the first top slide, the red parts is the ocean sea surface temperature changes, but it also goes into the deep ocean. And that affects the flow of pressure and winds above that, which then affects global weather patterns. La Niña is the opposite phase of El Niño, and this tends to occur with the reversal of the heating with rather cooling in the same areas as you may have had during the El Niño period. This also affects, and it's a simple principle, as you would know. Warm air tends to rise and cooler air tends to descend, and so the same principle holds then here as well. So El Niño, much ado about something, because it is in fact an existing phenomenon. It is the largest component of our internal climate variability. It's only in the last few decades that we have had a better understanding of this phenomenon. We now know that its impacts are global, We know that historically it has played a significant part in food security, especially with fisheries in South America. But we also know that as much as we have made significant progress in understanding it, there's still many, many questions to be answered. One of the components that we got to better understand is so-called ENSO, which is a coupling of the El Niño, the phenomenon that I just explained, and the Southern Oscillation. And the Southern Oscillation is really a change in pressure which was observed in the 1980s, in the 1980s, by a researcher looking at pressure changes in Darwin and in Tahiti. And he noticed a phase change in the pressure between those two areas. This has then led to research which couples the ocean and the atmosphere to get a better understanding of why this happens. And this has indeed increased our predictive skill in the 1990s for El Niño, even though there's some questions that still remain, especially in the context of a changing climate, where temperatures tend to be much higher than in the norm. I'll talk very quickly about some of the impacts that we know, and this being also a discussion focused on food security. Two parameters in particular which matter for food security, temperature and precipitation, will really be my focus for the next few minutes. The first one is El Niño precipitation impacts. Where you have the yellow tends to be drier, where you have the blue tends to be wetter, and of course in some cases where you have a green, especially in the Caribbean, you tend to have mixed signals, where you have seasonal reversal in particular. But for the focus of this discussion, being on Africa, if you keep a focus on that, you will note, of course, that the impact of El Niño tends to be towards a drier tendency, with some parts, of course, of Kenya, especially the northern parts of Kenya, as well as Ethiopia, the southern parts, and so forth, tending towards being generally wetter around the same time. Temperature impacts. Again, El Niño, a drier tendency in the greater part of Africa between July and September in the northern hemisphere and November to April in the southern hemisphere, southern Africa in particular. But also you can see significant parts in Australasia as well as in South America. The La Nina precipitation impacts tend to be the reverse, in general, to those of El Niño. Whereas it tends to be much drier in Southern Africa, for example. During the La Nina period, the precipitation tends to be much higher, and it tends to be wetter. Similarly, in the Northern Hemisphere, in the Sahel district, you also tend to have, from July and September, slightly wetter conditions. But again, the impact is reversed. If you look at Australasia, you tend to have much wetter conditions than is normal. This is important, I think, as an idea to keep in mind, especially when we try and understand better what the impacts are. Because invariably, where you've had droughts, when the rains do come, the impact could even be much more devastating than the drought itself, especially with flash floods and flooding episodes. The La Nina temperature impact also tends to be reversed, with slightly cooler conditions in Southern Africa and also over West Africa and South America in particular, and also warmer tendencies over areas in Asia Pacific. One impact that we have got a better grasp of over time is one on the seasonal hurricane season, where we tend, in El Niño episodes, tend to have less hurricanes over the Atlantic Basin and much more activity over the Pacific Basin. And here, I know I haven't showed it in the slide, but as much as it tends to be much drier over the Pacific, they do have significant episodes where the hurricane tracks, or the typhoon tracks, as we call, tend to have a southward tendency. And so you would recall some of the impacts on the small islands quite recently, in the last 2 years in particular, with, I think, the last one being just a few months ago, to affect Fiji and a few other islands. So, whereas the La Nina impact tends to be the opposite. We have much higher activity over the Atlantic, and so those of you who live in the US would know of this tendency, whereas elsewhere it tends to be much more suppressed activity. Actually, as we speak, there's a hurricane conference in Florida at the moment, and the idea and parts of the discussion there, as we now know that this phase of the El Nino is on a downward trend, what is likely to follow? And so NOAA will issue its normal annual official hurricane forecast in the next few weeks. And it would be interesting to see how we resolve the uncertainty that is still present in models about whether we will have neutral conditions and for how long we will have those neutral conditions. But I will come to that. So what we now know, of course, over time is that, and in fact I can safely remove the word can and say safely that it does affect. El Nino does affect tens of millions of people worldwide. It tends to have an increase in frequency of extreme events, whether it's droughts, floods, or fires. Food security is threatened. Often it's a severe reduction or even total loss of harvests, or the need to slaughter cattle. It has impact on health, especially for vector-borne diseases. The energy production, in particular hydropower, is impacted negatively, and the environment, mostly around the oceans in particular, with coral bleaching and so forth. So the last estimate, I haven't seen, I must apologize that I haven't presented any current figures for the current El Nino and the estimates of losses, but if we compare with the 1997-98 El Nino, where $30 to $100 billion was lost due to the impact of El Nino, we can reckon that in the current context, this would be a figure even much higher. I wouldn't be surprised if it was even 3 times higher. The global surface temperature anomalies, I was asked to speak a bit about the context of El Nino in changing climate. And what is important here is just to highlight 2 things. The red bars are where we have had El Nino years. And here the temperature has tended to be much higher. Even in the context where the blue bars are La Nina years, which tend to follow El Nino years, so that's one thing to note, is that normally we have, after an El Nino episode, we have a La Nina episode, which tends to have the reverse phase. These are still happening in a context where the previous ones, as we have noted in our climate statement, that the last decade has been the warmest decade on record. And so in this context, you have to ask, are the future El Ninos going to be, could we expect in a changing climate, future El Ninos to be as strong as the current one, if not even stronger? It is an open question because, again, some more research is required in that respect. I would like to spend a few minutes of the talk focusing on the current El Nino, 2015, 2016, as we know it, and what we project for the next few months. So in 2015, March, April, May, the sea surface temperatures in the eastern central Pacific increased, which then exceeded the typical El Nino. So all of this red spots that you note, especially the block on your right-hand side, for those who might not be able to see, on the left-hand axis is your periods. So starting with March, at the bottom is March 2016. At the top, it's April 2015, and then on the x-axis is the location starting with 80 degrees west, moving to 120 degrees east. And so the temperature, you'd see it was warmest in the east central Pacific. And so from June 2015 through September 2015, we had the largest sea surface temperature anomalies, which is departures from the norm, in this area. And these tended to shift westwards, away from the coast, deeper and deeper into the ocean. In late 2015, the eastern and central tropical Pacific Ocean, the surface temperature anomalies there exceeded 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, in some cases, they were recorded at 3 degrees above the norm. Highly unusual sea surface temperatures, and certainly the anomalies were quite extreme. And this provides us the evidence that this was one of the strongest El Niños on record, certainly comparable to the 1997-98 and the 1982 and the 1983 events. So what is the current status of the El Niño? It has now passed its peak period. And as you can see from the animation, the sea surface temperatures anomalies are dropping. But there's a positive equatorial sea surface temperature anomaly which continues across most of this equatorial Pacific, even though it is diminishing in strength. So the impacts of El Niño we can expect are not yet over, especially over the next few months. In the Niño period, I won't spend too much time on this because it's actually repetitive. It's that area of focus where the temperature has tended to change. So since 1981, we have seen more and more tendencies of the El Niño episodes, and what is important, followed by La Niña episodes. And what we are seeing is an increased level of activity. But what does this mean? I mean, it doesn't mean that we have the perfect prediction or forecast. You might recall in 2015, there was discussion of an El Niño, but that fizzled away over time because the temperatures didn't quite, even though it was the sea surface temperatures were warmer, it didn't quite get to El Niño type conditions. And of course, you might remember that there was also the discussion at the time about whether there was a temperature hiatus in the heating of the Earth system in general due to climate change. And of course, at the time, we had mentioned that we didn't have quite a clear understanding of what is happening in the deep ocean. And we know that the deep ocean is a good store of temperature and heat, in particular, with some inertia. And so with the release of that heat, of course, from May 2015 up to the present, we have seen the El Niño event. So what do we expect for the rest of the year? This is the probabilistic El Niño forecast, and I must apologize in advance. I didn't realize that these would be so small. Otherwise, I would have just chosen the one at the bottom. But I'll present this slightly differently later on. The one at the bottom is a probabilistic forecast, but the green bits show the neutral El Niño neutral conditions, and the blue is the La Niña, and the red is the El Niño. So you can see January, February, March on the left axis of 2016, still at its height, and then diminishing over time as we go toward June, July, August, and towards the end of the year, September, October, November, with the blue increasing, which means the tendency towards a La Niña. And so the current prediction is that we may have a La Niña conditions by the end of this year. But there is no general consensus on that as yet. In summary, then, we can say the powerful El Niño of 2015-2016 has passed its peak, but it remains strong, and will continue to influence global climate systems. It is also expected to weaken in the coming months and fade away during the second quarter of 2016. What are some of the impacts? In Eastern Africa, enhanced rainfall in countries including Kenya and Uganda, within the equatorial sector of the Greater Horn of Africa during the October to December short rainy season. But we know that in Ethiopia, in the 2015 spring rain, the rains failed. And El Nino affected rainfall patterns for the 2015 summer or the Kiremt rains, leading to serious food insecurity in the affected areas. In Southern Africa, I've already spoken about that, with the example of Zimbabwe. There was below average rainfall reported in a number of countries. And the World Food Programme estimated that more than 40 million people could become food insecure in this area. But also, in addition to the rainfall deficit, were heat waves, unprecedented. Certainly I was visiting South Africa in December. I was inappropriately dressed as I did not have shorts, nor any light shirts. I had taken a lot of formal wear with me. I was tempted to chop some of my pants off with an axe just to survive. South Asia, southwest monsoons, so some of the rainfall failed, but you would also know that in India, for example, most of the rainfall was 80% below its long period average. Southeast Asia, also droughts during the July to October period, and which helped to fuel the Indonesian wildfires. And you know the impact of those was huge on health in particular. The Pacific Islands, even though they have reduced rainfall, there was always the threat of tropical cyclones and their preferred tracks, which tended to go much more south. South America, of course, we know of the severe flooding in Paraguay in December, but also the higher probability of above rainfall in Mexico and other areas. So we can say with some confidence, again, hindsight is a perfect science. Out of the 26 El Nino events since 1960, since the 1900s, 50% of those were followed by neutral conditions, but 40% of those were followed by La Nina. And so you can, gives you a sense then of, if you're a gambling person, where you think the scientists or the science might lead us in respect of the next phase following the decline of the current El Nino. So let me talk quickly then to take out the gambling part and talk about the science. The El Nino outlook, here it just presents models, and these are global ensemble models from a number of global producing centers. And they all, of course, point to a decline of the El Nino by the month of August, except for one model, which suggests that El Nino may still continue into the next few months. This is just a same kind of slide, but more indicating the sea surface temperature anomalies. So I'm going to speed along because these are generally saying the same thing, and you will have access to them, and they will give you a bit of a different scenario. What I just wanted to highlight is this one on precipitation for March, April, May 2016, and you can see the brown is the areas where you have precipitation deficits. And for Southern Africa, of course, this does not bode well because in spite of coming out of the drought, where the rains have failed in the growing season, and going into the winter period, where generally there is very diminished agricultural activity anyway, means that that food security situation, insecurity situation does not diminish. Quickly, weather, climate, a seamless framework. I think I will skip the last part of my talk, which was about new initiatives and probably make interventions from the floor on those. But as meteorologists, we are informed by really this summary slide about where we would like to be as a science. The first one is what you're more familiar with on the extreme right axis at the top, the centuries. Those of you who are familiar with the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, would know about those scenarios and the models, etc. On the extreme, at the bottom here, on the green, that's where we tend to work, and that's what you are now familiar with, which is the weather scale. But in between, There are huge gaps in our knowledge and huge gaps in information which can be of use. On the seasonal scale, most of you are now familiar with the seasonal forecast, which is probabilistic. It gives you an idea about whether it's going to be wetter than normal or drier than normal or neutral, and also on temperature. But there are other activities that we are doing as well on research which will help close these gaps. And some of those initiatives are driven by what we call the Global Framework for Climate Services. And the idea behind this framework is, can we make climate information accessible just on the same scale as we do with weather information? And it's a multi-partner approach, and it calls for much greater working together as colleagues, especially across disciplines, but also across institutions. And this podium, I think, is going to be an interesting one to participate in. I will skip some of these about future investments, but please allow me to first appreciate the opportunity to be here, and of course, I'm accessible for any other questions you might have after this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremiah. That really interesting on the science side, and but done in a way that even I can understand. Well, let's turn to Chris then to talk about kind of how this is impacting the food security situation. Chris.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today to talk about a topic that FuseNet has been spending a lot of time on over the last year, the impacts of the current El Nino on food security. So before I jump into my presentation, maybe just a couple of quick points. So for those of you who aren't familiar with FuseNet, it's a USAID-funded activity that started in 1985 in response to a famine in West Africa. We now cover about 35 countries worldwide, and our primary role is to provide early warning of food security emergencies 6 to 12 months in advance. The other thing that I would mention is that today's panel is focused primarily on Africa, but just so that I don't miss the opportunity to plug the fact that the El Nino has had impacts around the world, and that we're seeing atypically high levels of food insecurity in a variety of places outside of Africa, particularly Haiti and Central America. So the other thing that I would just touch on before we get into talking about some of the food security impacts is a brief introduction to the IPC. The IPC is the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, and this is a global standard for talking about the severity of food insecurity. And so in the course of my presentation, when I talk about the numbers of food insecure people, I will be talking about those numbers in the context of this scale. So very briefly, it's a 5-phase scale with minimal food insecurity as phase 1 and famine as phase 5. And households that are in phase 3 or higher are households that need urgent humanitarian food assistance. And typically, when we're talking about food insecure populations at FuseNet, we're talking about the population that's in phase 3 or higher. So I think the big sort of takeaway message that we've really been trying to focus on over the past few months is that the estimated size of the food insecure population in 2016 is going to be 50% larger than it was last year. So we estimate about 44 million people will be in IPC phase 3 or higher during 2016. And I just want to highlight again the 50% increase. So 2015 was not a great year for food security. We had a major emergency that continues in South Sudan, a major emergency in Yemen, a major emergency in Nigeria. And so to have a 50% increase in the size of the population needing assistance between last year and this year is an enormous change. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is only in the countries that FuseNet covers. So for example, we don't cover Syria. So Syria is not included in this number. So again, the change between last year and this year has been significant, and of the 44 million people who need emergency food assistance, about 40% of those needs are directly attributable to El Nino, particularly in Ethiopia and Southern Africa, but as I mentioned, also in Haiti and Central America. So there are two areas I sort of wanted to dive into a little bit more. One of them is Ethiopia. So in 2015, in Central and Eastern Ethiopia, we had the worst drought in at least 50 years. So for those of you who are familiar with Ethiopia and the frequency with which droughts occur, this wasn't just another drought, this was a historic drought. And this drought had substantial impacts on livestock, on crop production, on water availability, on demand for labor. And so just as an example, this map is showing how yields for maize changed this year compared to sort of a typical year. And so everywhere that you see orange are areas where we've seen a substantial decline in yields of so the orange colors are yields dropped by 50% or more in those areas. So you can see these large areas of Tigray, Amhara, and Oromia where we had these massive declines in yield. This doesn't fully capture the crop losses that were experienced because this doesn't highlight changes in area planted. And so when you incorporate the reduced area planted that happened in Ethiopia, some of these areas had extremely large crop losses, again, even above and beyond what's on this map. And so as a result, we're expecting very atypical levels of food insecurity in Ethiopia this year. So this drought happened last summer, but the peak impacts on food security are going to happen this summer during the typical lean season. And this is FuseNet's classification of what food security is going to look like between June and September of this year. And you can see that large portions of Central and Eastern Ethiopia are in phase 3 crisis or are in phase 4 emergency, which is the second highest level on our scale. We currently expect that more than 10 million people in Ethiopia will require emergency food assistance in 2016. Making Ethiopia the country with the largest acutely food insecure population in the world. The other thing that I would highlight is that it's not just the numbers of people, but it's also the severity of the food insecurity we're expecting. So the areas in red, where we're anticipating IPC phase 4, phase 4 is characterized by extreme food deficits at the household level, by very high levels of acute malnutrition, and by excess mortality. And so in the absence of humanitarian assistance, we're expecting to see very, very severe outcomes in a lot of these places this summer. So the other area that we're watching very closely right now is Southern Africa. So as my colleague mentioned, Southern Africa, whose typical main rainy season is between about October and March, has had a very, very poor year. They had one of the worst starts of season on record, and rainfall to date has been the worst in at least 35 years in many parts of the region. The other issue is that this very poor season has followed 2014 rainfall that was also below average in many areas. So a lot of parts of the region are actually in their second consecutive drought year. And so this has had a large impact on crop production. This map is an output from the Early Warning Crop Monitor, which is a new product that's a number of different agencies, including the World Food Program and FuseNet, the University of Maryland, and a number of other institutions, getting together, looking at the available information on crops, crop production, field reports, remote sensing inputs, and estimating what current crop conditions are on the ground. So this is the map from their most recent update, focusing on Southern Africa. And so areas that are red, including all of Lesotho, all of Swaziland, significant parts of southern Zimbabwe and southern Mozambique are in failure. And then you have very poor crop conditions across large areas of South Africa, almost the entire remainder of Zimbabwe, southern Malawi, southern Zambia, and a number of other countries in the region. So very, very poor crop conditions. We've also seen, again, some of this has to do with this being the second consecutive dry year. We're seeing very limited water availability, and we're seeing big impacts on livestock in areas where cattle ownership is important. So in sum, at this point, we're looking at the potential to have crop production in Southern Africa that's 30 to 40% below average. We are just coming out, or just sort of wrapping up, the lean season in Southern Africa. And so I think one of the key things to think about is that we've had this terrible drought. We've had this major impact on food security, or on crop production. But we are a year away from the worst impacts on food security. So we would anticipate that the biggest impacts of this drought will be felt during the first quarter of 2017. So the good news is that I think this gives us collectively time to act. The challenge is that it's quite severe already. So just as another indicator of what's going on with food security in the region, this chart shows how maize prices across a variety of reference markets have changed in the last year. So across the region, you've seen maize prices increase 50 to 70%. So you've seen this massive increase in prices. And we have another year to go before we hit the peak impacts. And so our expectation is that there's about 4 million people right now in Southern Africa who are in phase 3 or higher. We expect that over the course of the coming year, we're going to see continued dryness into the winter season, as my colleague mentioned. We're going to see continued price shocks in the region, and we're going to see very little of the typical improvement in food security in the post-harvest period. And instead, we're going to see a substantial increase. We would expect at least a doubling of the food insecure population between now and early 2017. So maybe I'll leave Southern Africa for now, and we can talk more about that in the plenary session. But again, just to highlight that in Ethiopia, the needs are very large and imminent. In Southern Africa, they may not be as large yet, but they're going to get there by the beginning of 2017. Two other things I wanted to highlight before I wrap up. One has been, we've gotten a lot of questions about how the El Niño is likely to affect global food prices. And the good news is not very much. So this map, each of these sort of bubbles are crop-producing areas that we monitor. The ones with the dashed border are ones that are important for global food supplies. Areas that are green are well supplied, areas that are red are poorly supplied, and areas in orange are kind of in the middle. And so the good news has been that despite the very substantial impacts on crop production that the El Niño has had, most of those have been focused in areas that are not major global suppliers: Central America, Southern Africa, parts of Eastern Africa. And so in general, global supplies of maize and wheat and rice are near average or better than average, and prices are significantly below average. And the outlook for most of those crops is also good. The one caveat, the one thing we're watching a little bit more closely is rice. Southeast Asia has had a poor year in terms of rainfall. Their harvest prospects aren't as good. So definitely something we're keeping an eye on. But in general, global food supplies and global food prices haven't been affected by the El Niño. Now, if we look ahead, as was mentioned earlier, one of the things we're watching very closely is how likely is it that we will transition to a La Nina during 2016. And we're particularly interested in what's going to happen towards the end of this year, and that's still 6 to 9 months away. And so the skill of the forecast that we have available doesn't allow us to make very precise statements yet. But as my colleague mentioned, there is a significant and increasing likelihood that we will transition to a La Nina by the end of the year. And so this is a map similar to the one that was shown earlier that shows typical impacts of La Nina on rainfall. And there's two things I would highlight. The first is that La Ninas are associated with drought in the Horn of Africa. So the last time we went from an El Nino to a La Nina was in 2010, and as I think we're probably all familiar, that La Nina in 2010 drove severe droughts in the Horn of Africa at the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011, which resulted in the famine in Somalia. So I think La Ninas are strongly associated with drought in this part of the world, and these areas of the world are, even if they are doing relatively better in terms of food security now, things can change quickly. So we're definitely concerned about the likelihood of drought in the Horn this year. The other thing is that La Ninas tend to bring drier than normal conditions to some key maize and wheat producing areas of the world, particularly Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. And so this question of impact on global food supplies and global prices is something we're going to keep monitoring, because La Nina may end up having more of a significant impact on this than the El Nino did. So I will close there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Dina.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have any interesting slides, but hopefully I can still keep your attention. I want to just start by thanking CSIS and Jennifer and her colleagues for shining a light on this very important issue of food security in El Nino. I think it is right that it's hard to get press attention and attention on this crisis, because I think for a number of reasons. I mean, we're facing the largest refugee crisis in the world today. We have massive and impactful crises in places from Syria to Yemen to South Sudan that are grabbing headlines. But I think there's another dimension to this, which is just that, what is El Nino? Is it a fire? Is it a drought? Is it a flood? Is it a hurricane? Is it a heat wave? Is it, it's all of these things, and it's happening over a very long period of time. And so it's very hard to, there's no quick soundbite. It's very hard to put your arms around, and it makes it a problem for people who are trying to tell that story, even for us as we try to sort of package the nature of the responses. USAID is responding globally all over the world to these different events and in different ways, but I think you were right today to drill down on Ethiopia and Southern Africa. Ethiopia has almost half of all of the food security needs driven by El Nino. So it's just a huge part of the El Nino crisis. And Southern Africa is soon to give Ethiopia a run for its money. Jennifer started out by saying we'd be remiss in not talking about non-food impacts of El Nino, and I was also thinking the same thing, and just to note that there are things that aren't intuitive about drought, for example, which are coming to light. We know that, for example, health clinics are closed at a time when people acutely need health care because there's no water in those clinics. Schools are closing. Kids are out of school because there's no water in the schools. You have real concerns about disruption of HIV/AIDS treatments because people on antiretrovirals don't have water and food to take their medication with, and so they default on taking those medications. Significant concerns about protection as people struggle to cope. Women and children walking farther and farther to access water. increases in transactional sex, children going off to urban centers to beg. All this is just to say that I think the dimensions of the crisis and its impacts are more far-reaching than we can perhaps even imagine at this point in time. Turning to Ethiopia, I wanted to start by talking briefly about the resilience policy that AID launched in the aftermath of the drought in 2012 in the West Africa area, the famine in Somalia 2011. And that policy calls on relief and development practitioners inside the agency to think differently about areas of chronic poverty and recurrent crisis. It calls on them to sit together, to do shared analysis, and to do something we refer to as sequence, layer, and integrate relief and development activities in ways that improve vulnerable households' ability to cope with ever more frequent shocks. So one of the hallmarks, if I could leave you with one point, is that our response in Ethiopia, which is large and at scale, is joining up relief and development projects in complementary ways. I'm going to drill down right now on the relief side of that, and Greg Collins is going to be talking a little more in the second panel about how that links up with the development side. We are the largest provider of humanitarian assistance among the bilateral donors in Ethiopia. One extraordinary thing about this drought response is it's the Ethiopian government that is the largest provider of relief to date. They have provided an extraordinary sum of money and are really mobilizing their people and their systems to do a response. That is very noteworthy in and of itself. The U.S. spent $546 million in humanitarian assistance in FY15 and in 16 to date, close to $300 million of that just this year. We have already purchased and shipped to Ethiopia more food than we provided for all of last year, so some 447,000 tons, and we will be providing more in the coming months, and that is, as I said, more food than we gave for all of last year. There are also a variety of interventions around providing safe drinking water, supporting nutrition and health interventions, providing seeds and livestock support to jumpstart recovery. So in sum, we think there are 5 critical components of the drought response that need to be delivered in tandem to effectively address the effects. First and foremost, food assistance. Those of you who follow the food assistance agenda know that we are doing a lot of cash transfers and voucher-based programs. In Ethiopia, these are going to become increasingly limited because many local markets cannot respond to a scaling up of cash. There's just too large a food deficit in the country. We have prioritized in-kind food assistance for this response. Second, we're pushing for a scaling up of comprehensive nutrition treatment programs at the community level. This is to treat moderate acute malnutrition and then to rapidly refer cases of severe acute malnutrition to stabilization centers. We want to see an expanded support to health posts and stabilization centers to treat those SAM cases because that's where we know we're going to have critical spikes in mortality if that's not addressed. Fourth, livelihood interventions need to be part of the package, not during some later recovery period, but right now. We need effective drought cycle management for livestock, provision of seeds in time for the next planting season, and finally, a robust package of WASH interventions. So without safe water, the food access doesn't particularly help. You can treat a child for malnutrition, but then if they go home and they don't have access to water, you start the cycle all over again. Protection is a cross-cutting issue for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and we need to really ramp up on the logistics support because while there are systems in place, those systems are designed for a much smaller caseload of people in need. So what's working well? 2 things I would highlight about this response, and that's quite different from previous decades, and which is what we hope is going to preclude this drought from becoming a full-blown famine. One is early warning. Chris's presentation, I hope, gave you a sense of how important early warning has come, how important it is, and how increasingly sophisticated it's become. We meet monthly with the FUSE team to hear their projections, and it has played a vital role in our planning. Second, response systems are in place today that we have not had in previous decades. There are 2 food assistance pipelines and a system called Community Management of Acute Malnutrition, which distinguish this response from previous decades. The Productive Safety Net food pipeline is one that I was hoping there'd be somebody here to talk about, but this is a safety net that already serves 8 million chronically vulnerable households with a timely and regular food transfer along with other support. And that is accompanied by a humanitarian response system that year on year provides food assistance to those households who are not in the safety net but who have transitory food needs. The U.S. is a regular provider to both the PSNP and these emergency pipelines through multi-year funded relief and development programs. We traditionally cover 25 to 35% of those programs, and one of the reasons our response has been so early and so robust is that we made a commitment early on to sustain those percentage levels even as the numbers grew. That takes a lot of juggling of responses globally, but it was understanding the famine-prone nature of the country and the acute needs that were growing. We made that commitment early on. Likewise, we're promoting the CMAM, the Community Management of Acute Malnutrition programs, with technical support, training, activities, and of course, specialized food products. We now have, the U.S. provides ready-to-use therapeutic foods to prevent and treat malnutrition. These are actually new dimensions of the relief program. The U.S. didn't traditionally provide those, but we have revamped and revitalized the in-kind food aid basket to better meet the nutritional needs of vulnerable households. What do we need to do better? We need to boost the overall tempo and pace of the response. Some of you may have heard of L3 emergencies. The UN uses that designation to say this is really a big deal, and we need to, move forward with real vigor to get things moving. We need to act accordingly, as if this is an L3 emergency. We need more timely and accurate data collection, including gaps analysis, which tell us whether the suite of interventions I've described are getting to the right places at the right time. We need expanded staffing capacities at warehouses and food distribution points, more operational efficiencies from the ports to the last mile where relief meets those who need it, and more financial resources from the global community to respond. This month, USAID Administrator Gail Smith announced the activation of a Disaster Assistance Response Team, a DART, a team of experts who are in Addis coordinating the U.S. response and who will be intensely focusing on the gaps that I've just mentioned. We're doing our part to support the government of Ethiopia, which is really leading on this response, and the USAID mission and the embassy are calling on other donors to likewise step up and scale up their support. Southern Africa, the crisis at a much earlier stage. There's still a dearth of analysis, I think, in some areas. We're getting a good grip on the food needs, but we have a much less systematic way of looking at nutritional impacts, water. The nutrition surveillance systems across these countries are not what they need to be, I think, for us to really get a grip on that. There's a lot of ongoing assessments for us to better understand the nature of the crisis. But I expect that a similar package, such as I described for Ethiopia, will be required across Southern Africa in multiple countries. In line with our resilience agenda, we've already authorized multi-year food security programs to shift development dollars to better address drought and flooding, and we've plussed up those development programs with additional emergency monies in order for them to do that. Nonetheless, as in Ethiopia, the scale of the crisis is going to require large-scale relief interventions. We've already provided $94 million in El Nino-related support to Southern Africa in 15 and 16. Our food pipeline planning has doubled and tripled since the beginning of the fiscal year as we begin to understand more the magnitude of what's coming at us in the coming year. And so we do expect that there's potential for the Southern Africa response to be even more difficult and complex than the Ethiopian one, as we're working across multiple governments, multiple countries with their own unique characteristics. On the plus side, we've got early warning. We have very little in the way of conflict, which so often derails our efforts to reach people in need. And we have a tremendous opportunity, I think, if we think collectively, to really get it right for these slow onset emergencies. We've had time and we've got the tools, I think, to do it. In both Ethiopia and Southern Africa, we are afforded an opportunity to put to the forefront some of the issues that have come up in the World Humanitarian Summit: local capacity, local direction, supporting existing systems, linking relief and development programs in a way that are mutually reinforcing. So, thanks.
Thank you, Dina. We have about 30 minutes for questions and answers, and so we'll turn to the audience. I have just two questions maybe to start out. One is on the urban versus rural needs. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, we tend to think of this as a rural crisis, but I imagine that even in the big urban centers, there's major crisis, particularly with the price hikes. And the second is, Dina, you talked about the food pipeline. And just before this session, we were talking about Kenya, which is actually having a very good year. South Africa, often in times of food crisis in Southern Africa, is kind of a food reserve, but it's having problems of its own right now. And so what is the food pipeline coming from? What does it look like? So I'll start with those. Maybe you want to respond to those, and then we'll take a few at a time from the audience question.
So on the urban versus rural issue, I mean, to be frank, I think we have much less visibility on sort of what's going on with urban food security in most places. There are some countries like Somalia where I think there's been a lot more substantive work done on monitoring urban food security. So I think the issues around increasing staple food prices, particularly in Southern Africa, is certainly likely to affect urban populations. I don't think that the severity of food insecurity that we're anticipating in the rural areas will occur in the urban areas. So I think the needs will still very much be concentrated in the rural areas that have been worst affected by these droughts, but I think there's certainly going to be an increase in need in urban areas, and it's just not something that I think we collectively have a great handle on.
Just to add, I think in Ethiopia, I'm not an expert in this program, but there is a subsidized program, food assistance program that the government runs, which helps to stabilize prices in urban centers, which could bring some relief in those areas. In terms of the food pipelines, Ethiopia is going to be importing lots of food, and the cross-border informal trade is not going to be sufficient to meet the needs commercially, and the purchasing power has been depleted such that I don't think you're going to see the kind of movement you would need, nor would there be enough food in the region to do it. Most of the food that's coming is being commercially imported through Djibouti. The government of Ethiopia has purchased commercially large millions of tons of food, and there is also U.S. food coming in, as I've said, from the United States. We are buying large quantities of food in Tanzania for other regional responses, Uganda as well for other regional responses. So we are making use of local and regional procurement where it makes sense. This is one of a lot of responses ongoing in the region. They can't all come from the same thing. We do have to import some food. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Tisch, and I work for Crown Agents USA. Thank you very much for an enlightening discussion and presentations. And I'm just wondering, in terms of Ethiopia, livestock are often seen as an asset and a measure of resilience, and I'm wondering what the impact is on livestock herds right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Chala. I am Ethiopian, and then also I'm teaching here economics, statistics. So I just I'm following up the Ethiopian drought and then also development situation. So what I'm hearing from the presentation was with USAID and then also with FEUSNET, all is focusing on relief, like assistance, early, the assistance. As you may, everybody knows about Ethiopia, this drought or famine is not a new thing. It is in the 60s, 70s, you see this cycle, and then it's now frequently it is occurring every 10 years, even now. So usually, even before this El Nino case in Ethiopia, there were 10 million people who are in acute food insecurity situations. So there is shortage already there. So when this El Nino is happening, this is an addition to that situation. So now people are in a situation to be starved and then possibly to die because of shortage of food. So what I'm arguing is that I think the Ethiopian case don't seem to be a natural or environmental change or something, but it should be some long-term solution which we have to find out. So what happened is, for example, what we hear from all world like development agencies, World Bank, IMF, the United States government, the European Union, what they are provoking is what Ethiopia is achieving, a miracle of development. As usual, it's like 11% GDP growth for the last 10 years or 15 years. And then when I was looking into some articles published by economists, it's saying that Ethiopia, in the last 10 years, it tripled its crop production. So crop production
Right.
for the I'm coming up. So, and then also you see here in World Bank data, I see the crop production is growing all over, even compared to the neighboring countries, it is growing a lot. So what I'm saying is that if there was a food production already in the last 10 years, why shouldn't be a mechanism to save food, like to develop asset, and then all those kind of long-term solutions.
I'm just going to stop you because actually our second panel deals specifically with that. And in fact, there's someone from the Ethiopian Embassy, and I think Greg Collins has spent a lot of time looking precisely at that. What is the longer-term strategy?
But I just want to know if what USAID or FEWSnet is doing in this respect, like in finding those kind of long-term solutions for that country.
Right. Well, that's what Greg Collins will speak. Did you want to speak to that, Dina? Let me just take one more question. The gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Anja Timbo, coming from Save the Children. I have a question and then a suggestion. The question is for Mr. Lengoasa. I want you to shed some light on my ignorance. You are talking about El Nino being a kind of conflict between the atmosphere and the Pacific Ocean. So my question is just the Pacific Ocean, knowing that there are so many oceans. That's the first question. The second is just a suggestion, because at the end of the intervention, we're talking about urban versus rural. And we have my suggestion for all those people who will be intervening later, those NGOs, to think about those two poles. Because we know that the last crisis that we have in 2007, the riots came from the cities.
Right.
So we cannot say that the situation in rural it won't be any problem, because the basket, the producers are in the rural areas, while the consumers are in the cities. And then they constitute those who can destabilize the countries.
Right. Thank you very much. Should we go down the panel? You want to answer about the...
Thank you very much. Actually, there's only one ocean, as we all know, but we have various basins. The first identification of El Nino came from the Pacific. But we now know, as I said, due to the coupling of the ocean and the atmosphere and the changing weather patterns that are affected by El Nino episode in the Pacific, they are global. And so that's how we end up with changes in weather patterns which are global.
Great. FEWSnet on the longer term?
Sure, I was going to comment on the livestock question. So I think there's sort of two big impacts that we've seen in Ethiopia in terms of livestock. So in Afar, in northern Somali region, and in parts of eastern Oromia, which are pastoral, we've seen, particularly last year, very large atypical livestock deaths, so hundreds of thousands of livestock deaths. And obviously that has a big impact on households who rely on those animals for food and income. The other thing that we've seen is that in some of the worst affected areas, particularly we've been looking recently at parts of eastern Oromia, while the value of livestock on some of the major urban markets has been relatively stable, we've seen very sharp declines in the value of livestock on local markets because those body conditions are poor and because people are selling more livestock than usual, so supplies are increasing. And so that sort of devaluing of these assets, in addition to the fact that it's more difficult for people to earn income from other sources and the prices of food are increasing, has had a very serious impact on purchasing power in those areas.
Right. Yeah, I think as I started my comments, there's always a danger in giving just half the story. There really is a nice connection between the development and the relief activities that are ongoing right now. I think that you do have this impressive growth in Ethiopia, as you've pointed out, but you also have millions of people who are still living at the margins. And while we have evidence that our development programs are helping people cope with moderate shocks, severe shocks like the one we're facing now, a historic drought, it simply is not possible to do it all with our development approach. There has to be this complementary and interconnectedness between the two. We have, as I've talked about, opportunities to buy from Ethiopian farmers. Where that makes sense, we do that. Ethiopian farmers are also commercial actors. They're not stockpiling their food for a rainy day. They're selling it so that they can continue to buy inputs and grow more food. So we don't have huge carryover stocks, which allow the kind of idea where, well, if we had a great harvest 5 years ago, why don't we have all of this food available to then distribute now? I don't know, Chris, if you have anything more on stockpiles, but thanks.
If I may, just on the livestock question, and only because I'm excited about a new initiative which was launched in December as part of an early warning system, and it's a national U.S. multi-agency entity looking specifically at Rift Valley fever and vector diseases. And I know it has an impact on food security because of the way that it is transmitted. And following an El Nino period, it has been on evidence being very clear that you then have a subsequent outbreak of Rift Valley fever. And so our capability and ability to predict this as part of the early warning systems, this has now gone operational, I think, as of December, and it comes out as as a monthly bulletin. I think would add great value to understanding even better the value chain and the impacts going forward. So interesting stuff.
Great.
Hi. Just two quick things. I wonder if there has been any effort to, in the assistance program, to focus at all on child spacing and or to look at disease prevention like meningitis, for example, which often becomes endemic during periods of drought and high dust.
Hi, I'm Zach Blackburn from the U.S. Department of State. Thank you for your presentations today. So my question is primarily for Chris. So you mentioned through at least the end of El Nino, there won't be significant shocks to global staple food prices. And so I was wondering what role you saw increased trade playing in a response, at least in Southern Africa. I know that South Africa has already started to loosen some import restrictions, so just a little bit of commentary on that.
Okay. Hi. My name is Scott Tickner. I'm also with the State Department in the Africa Bureau. My question's early for the first speaker. If I understood your diagrams, you had a strip of of the weather impacts predicted for La Nina that stretched into West Africa, which currently, if I understand correctly, is not impacted by El Nino. And I wonder if that's an accurate understanding of a sort of future concern of weather patterns that impact West Africa. And another related La Nina question is again, if I got the numbers right, we're talking about a 40 to 50% chance of a La Nina following El Nino. Although the charts that you put up made it look like an almost automatic kind of historical follow-on to El Nino followed by La Nina. To me, a 50-50 chance doesn't seem like a high probability. It sounds like kind of, even odds. And I wonder if for the scientists, that's a high probability, or if that's really higher than it sounds. I wanted to also mention that last week, we published a DipNote blog. It's a blog on the El Nino situation in Africa. It might be of general interest. It's on the State Department website, and it captures the basic story that we've outlined today. Thank you.
Hi, Richard Campbell, Congressional Research Service. I'm wondering if Jerome can speak to whether there's a climate change link with regard to increasing global temperatures, meaning more or longer El Niños or La Niñas.
Let's do the same. Go down this way.
Let me start with the last question, actually, because the link to climate change and El Nino episodes in the future is not clear yet. I think there's still a lot of research that's required, because what we can see, of course, is over time, looking back, is that the return period for the El Ninos is relatively the same as it was in the past, followed very closely by El Nino in at least 40% of the cases. So it's not a high probability at this stage that we would have the current El Nino followed by a La Nina. But what the dynamic models, and it's I think part of the pictures that I showed was a slide showing the multi-model ensemble. So depending on the initiation of the model, you can have a very different outcome. And the one that actually assumes that the El Nino will continue towards the end of the year has assumed the same sea level temperatures as we have had at this period in the past year. Whereas the initial periods for the other models is a different initiation of those models, which then show that you would have the likelihood is that we would have either neutral conditions, which then precede an El Nino.
So when will you know?
We normally would know very close to the period, actually, because we work in blocks of 3 months. And the next phase, I think the last slide that I showed was a forecast from February. We are now in March, so in April, there will be another run of the models to indicate how far the season will evolve. So we can say certainly with some certainty that we know at this point. Let me put it in brief terms. We are much better at predicting the decline and the decay of an event rather than the onset. Yeah. And I think that's where we have some difficulty. Again, the multi-models are helping to give us scenarios of how it may come about. And then again, depends on whether you're looking at dynamical models, which are largely driven from atmosphere, ocean, or statistical, which is just based on history. So I think that distinction is probably what I didn't make very clear in presenting the slides, whether those are drawn from statistical models or from dynamical models, because the outputs of the two can be very, very different. And just one quick question on the or response to the meningitis issue. We did have a huge initiative on meningitis a few years ago, actually in the 90s. What helped was the discovery of a vaccine which then meant the early warning systems basically became almost, redundant. Because you had a vaccine to help deal with that issue much very early on, especially for child vaccinations. And I think that's still currently what is being used.
So maybe one comment on the La Nina probability piece, just because this is a question that has come up before, is so if the consensus model that was shown earlier, by the end of the year, it's somewhere between a 50 and 60% chance. So one potentially useful way to think about it is to compare it to what the normal probability of a La Nina at that time of year would be. And the normal probability is something like 30%, 25, 30%. So a 50 to 60% probability means that it is twice as likely that we're going to have a La Nina as in a typical year. On the question about trade and Southern Africa, this is definitely something we're looking at. So again, the specific harvest numbers in Southern Africa aren't available yet, but if we are talking about a 30 to 40% drop compared to average, we're talking about, in the range of an 8 to 10 million metric ton cereal deficit. So that is a huge quantity of cereals to bring into the region. One of the big questions is the degree to which port capacity in the region is sufficient to bring in that quantity of cereals. So there are ports that can handle these large volumes in South Africa, but to the degree that we're talking about issues in Malawi or Zambia or Zimbabwe, this can be quite a journey even once you get the food into South Africa. So there has been an exploration of how likely is it that ports, for example, in Mozambique, really have the ability to take in these large volumes. And I think that question is still unresolved. So, but I think this issue of the region's capacity to bring in the quantity of cereals they need is definitely a question of focus for us.
Thanks. I don't have a lot to add. Just to another comment, vaccination campaigns in general are a major part of the emergency responses globally. UNICEF leads on those. There's generally one of the very first concerns is measles, and the response includes vaccination programs. Child spacing, generally our development programs focused on food security and the health of the mother and the child include behavior change and messaging on child spacing. There's no reason to think that those programs will be disrupted. Folks are not migrating in vast numbers. Those programs will continue, and as such, those messages should continue.
Oh, don't I want to go back to the food prices. My name is Anthony Kumson. I work with the Food for the Hungry. I want to understand that food prices are speculative of the environment. And what we have found right from Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, is that farmers are responding to the fact that productions are low, and they are seeing that they have to feed their own markets, as well as, like Dina said, satisfy the possibility of local and regional purchases. So I want to ask again, are you looking behind, that is backwards, on the food prices, or we are looking forward? Because it is playing very well in all the programs, the development programs and everything we're doing right now. And I want to hear from you, FuseNet, to let us know whether your numbers are reflecting the changes in prices, because it's going up, it's not down. So I want to ask, how does it feel, or how does it reflect to you then?
Sure. So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking, are we looking at price trends to date, or are we looking forward? So the chart that I presented was looking at prices to date. just as an example of what's happened over the last year. But when FuseNet does its forward-looking projections, we do price projections through what we call our outlook period. So for example, the outlooks we just released in February look through September, and for each of those outlooks within a country in a key area that we're concerned about, we'll do a process of projecting staple food prices ahead 8 months and then incorporate that into our analysis.
We will end this panel here. I encourage you to stand up and stretch, but please don't go far because we want to move directly into the next panel. So thank you very much to our presenters. That was really excellent.